Hello, travel junkies and frequent flyer mile nerds. This is Paul, and welcome to the very first episode of the Travel Punks podcast. My inaugural guest, lawyer, world traveler, expat, and owner of Seaboss Coats. Check it out at seabosscoats.com and on Instagram and on Facebook, my friend Carla. We talk about her expatriation to London, the Joker movie, and the difference in race relations and safety across the pond. Ladies and gentlemen, Carla of Seaboss Coats.
Lots of people will come to London and they'll say, it's a nice city, but it's not for me. Or it's a nice city, but I wouldn't want to live there.
Just Americans or everyone?
Anyone would say this. It all depends on what you like. I like it and I want to live there. I love the variety of people there from all over the world. I love the never-ending options of things to do that interest me. It's just, I just feel like home. Finally, I've come home. And I also feel very accepted there.
Yeah? In a way that you weren't in the U.S.?
And I also feel very safe there.
Yeah.
In ways that I have not felt in the U.S. at all. So that's why, at this point in my life, I can see myself living there for the rest of my life.
What feels more accepting about the UK and safer about the UK than the US, if that's not too sensitive a question?
Right. So one of the big problems we have in this country is guns. Now, some people may say guns don't kill people. People kill people. I'll let that stay as it is. I'm not going to go into that argument. But I will say, in the UK, people aren't allowed to have guns. Police officers generally do not walk around with guns. There's a special team of officers specially trained to handle guns that they are armed with guns. But most of your officers don't have guns. It is extraordinarily rare for anyone in London to be shot to death. We're not going to have what we have in America, where you have a party and we have a mass shooting. You know what I mean? We have definitely knife crime, but knives are very different from guns. Generally, you can't kill as many people in one episode with one knife as you can with one automatic gun, the sort of gun that's sold here in America to anyone with a driver's license, essentially. That's one reason why I feel safer. Another reason I feel safer is because, this is just my perspective as someone who was not actually brought up in the UK, but was brought up in America and was exposed to so many reports of unarmed people being shot dead by police officers. Who knows for what reason? I say who knows for what reason, but there are plenty of people who say the reason is because the officers were black and the unarmed people. The officers were white and the unarmed people were black. So being black in America, some people might say, is a risk factor that's going to get you shot if a police officer stops you for speeding or failing to signal a turn or a lane change. For whatever reason, in America, there is this issue with unarmed people getting shot by officers. I never have to deal with that in the UK. There's not that kind of friction. Again, I remind you, I was not brought up there. Someone brought up there might have a very different perspective on the situation in the UK. They have told me, black people in the UK have told me, Carla, it's just as bad here as it is in America. And as someone who was brought up in America, I can't to agree, because I haven't seen a single report like what I've seen routinely in America with all of these young people being shot by police officers.
Well, you can't ignore the fact that it's harder to get shot by a cop if the cop doesn't have a gun.
Exactly. Absolutely.
There's a certain amount of common sense there.
Right. Another reason I feel safer is because I think I don't want to say anything negative about America, but I will say over there it just seems that the government and people in general, society, just has a more humane perspective on societal ills, just on human beings in general. People just seem to be a little bit more humane towards each other. Mm-hmm. And here, in this country, well, the fact that we have a death penalty speaks for itself. Mm-hmm. And that's all I have to say about that. We are, in America, perhaps a bit less humane than Europeans.
Mm-hmm. There's a great documentary series by David Starkey, who I think I don't know if he's passed away or if he's still alive or not, but it was called Monarchy.
Right.
Are you familiar with it?
No.
So good. And it went through all the kings of England and queens of England from the earliest times, but he had 2 points that really hit me hard, which was the idea that humans are naturally attracted to a monarchy, whether it's a monarchy in name or a dictatorship or a presidency with unitary authority, which is what we have in the United States, at least since Bush, and probably going further back. But he also points out that the idea of monarchy being responsive to the people at all, some sort of authority and system where the king is answerable to the people, goes back way further in British history in a way it doesn't go back in some of its neighbors' history, like France, which had a long history of authoritarian monarchy. The same deal in Spain and some other places in the area, but we know about Louis XIV, the Sun King, much more autocratic form of rule, and certainly Russia, whereas very early on, British people insisted on accountability from their monarchs, and the monarchs who tried to take absolute authority often ended up failing.
You're referencing the Magna Carta, aren't you?
Among other things. It apparently goes back even further. And John, the king who was responsible for the Magna Carta being created, had a lot of his own failings, but also tried to seize a lot of authority that traditionally hadn't been monarchical. He thought he needed it because his kingship was failing. I think I'm getting this right. But the people pushed back against it. And other British kings were executed or sent into exile or abdicated. And this habit of the king being answerable to the people goes back to the English more so than the way that the Americans of today think they invented it. The English settlers of the Americas who became the first Americans were building on something that the British had invented, and maybe in some ways they felt like the kings had forgotten. Recent kings certainly had forgotten about it. Henry VIII had done what he had done, and his children all failed in various ways. I mean, Elizabeth had a long reign, but she very carefully tried not to establish autocratic rule, even though she really wanted to. Never had children, and did all she could to maintain a form of power that was weak because it was based on the president's or the king's personality. Freudian slip there, but we can see that in Trump and Obama and Bush, how personality-based our form of monarchy has become.
You call us, the American government, a monarchy?
It's ruled by one person.
Really? That wasn't my understanding.
It's not the way our Constitution is written, but the president has a lot of power now. I mean, I hate to keep referencing things to movies because I know movies are representations of art and also of the filmmaker's opinion, but have you seen the movie Vice?
I I'm not certain I have. When was it? When did it come out?
Recently, last couple of years, Christian Bale
I
plays
did
Dick
see
Cheney.
that movie. Yeah, absolutely, I saw it. Yes.
I liked that movie. I didn't like it as much as The Big Short, but I liked it a lot. And that movie, at least, which I'm not referring to it as the last word, but that movie, at least, lays the expansion of the president's authority at Dick Cheney's feet.
Right.
Opportunistically, due to the fact that he had George Bush Jr. wrapped around his thumb, and they had an opening in the form of mass panic after 9/11.
Right.
And the theory of the unitary executive, which they used to craft the torture memos and pass the Patriot Act and just kind of keep. So it almost feels like the American trend, not that this is the way it has to be or that this was the way it would be if we adhered to the founding documents, but the trend has been to consolidate power in the hands of the president.
Do you think that this trend might have started as far back as World War I or World War II with FDR?
In a way, it started with Theodore Roosevelt,
Right,
or in a
that's
way,
one.
it started with Lincoln, taking war powers that Congress very much disagreed with.
Did you see that Lincoln movie?
I did see that Lincoln movie. We're getting all our history from Lincoln, from movies.
They do a good job
We're
of
such
it,
slackers,
though.
but
It's educational.
but
The good ones are really informative.
but Lincoln's line there, where it's so descriptive of executive power, of an idea of executive power that has gotten so ingrained in American culture, when the character of Lincoln says, "I decided that I needed war powers. I wasn't sure that the Constitution gave them to me, but I hoped that it would be decided that it would. Eventually the court might decide that I was wrong."
Right.
So, and people praise Lincoln up and down for acting in a way that he thought needed to be acted, even though he may not, or arguably did not, have constitutional authority for it.
Very strangely Republican, wouldn't you say? Maybe not Republican at all, but very liberal.
I don't think that, and I don't think that that's limited to one party or another. I mean, I was a much bigger fan of Obama than I ever was of Bush, but I am sensitive to the argument that Obama took just as much advantage of the unitary executive theory as explained in the movie Vice and by Antonin Scalia or whoever might have been the progenitor of it. But it is the idea that goes back to Nixon saying that when the president does it, that means it is not illegal.
Right.
And that is part and parcel of what David Starkey gets into in his Monarchy series, because when the British brought charges of high crimes to the king,
Right.
in some ways it was an absolute oxymoron, because the king is justice.
Where do you think we would be right now if President Johnson didn't do what he felt he had to do to strong-arm the Civil Rights Bill through? There is an argument, maybe, for these figures of history to behave just the way they have behaved for the greater good.
Yeah. And they use totalitarian means to achieve ends that we ultimately are glad that they did. It's complicated. It's sticky.
Right.
And part of me just likes to sit back and say, it's happened before and it will happen again. I don't expect America to last forever, not because I want it to go away, but because every empire has had its heyday and its decline. Every empire, every world power, whatever you want to call it.
Where's it going to go if it's not going to be here forever?
God, I don't like to think about it, because it'll be some sort of lawlessness to fill the vacuum of law. You know, state governments might establish more authority, and it could be some version of the Wild West, but that's a headache above my pay grade. I've never studied deep enough into what happens when...
But, you know, America's a young country.
That's true.
You look at these other countries, other parts of the world, hundreds and hundreds of years old. They're still here.
Yeah.
They just change.
Yeah.
America will change.
And dynasties have declined and been replaced by other dynasties, and the people are still there. I mean, that's what's impressive. The people are still there, regardless of the changes. Oh, what were we talking about? Movies? London?
You did ask me why I feel safer there. I think I kind of answered that.
Yeah, and I have friends and family who feel equally passionately on both sides of the gun debate. All I can say, because you mentioned training, is that various pro-gun friends have asked me if I'm ever going to get a gun. And the answer and I live in Texas, so it's a very normal, expected thing for people to have guns. But the answer to that question is that I would never buy a gun unless I could go through one of those tactical trainings that Keanu Reeves went through to get ready for the John Wick movies, where you see the YouTube videos where he like empties one magazine and then replaces the magazine in a quarter of a second and then empties that one and then drops the gun and picks up another gun and shoots just like a whole army platoon worth of targets as part of his training. And I don't want to suggest that that's bloodthirstiness, other than to say I don't want to have a potentially dangerous tool that I don't know how to use, especially if it could be turned against me.
Another interesting thing that I've experienced, and this is again just my perspective, it may not hold true for everyone, this is just me. So I am Caribbean American. My mum's from the Caribbean, my dad's American. I have brown skin. In America, I run into an interesting thing with how people look at me because of my brown skin. And it seems to be kind of a big thing in America to be black.
Yeah, I've heard it's a thing.
Yeah. So in London, my being black is not such a big thing, just from my experience. Here it's super important. What category are we going to put you in? Are you African American? So we're going to have this entire set of assumptions placed on you because of your skin color. And where I am in London, politeness and manners and accent matter a whole lot more than your ethnicity and your skin color. But that's just my perspective. It might not be true, but that's just my perspective based on my experience there for a year and a half living in London.
Right. Well, my European friends who come to America are very blasé talking about race. And they're like, oh, that person's black, that person's Asian. And it's weird how people get their hackles up, because in a way they're just stating facts, but we're burdened by a racial history that they aren't. And so, like, one of my friends was like, yeah, this is my black friend. I'm like, and here that would get a person to say, oh, you have only one black friend? Is that your token black friend? Whereas like, no, he's my black friend. It's like, why are you identifying it? But why are we getting our hackles up over an objective fact? And it's because of this loaded history. And I mean, in America was an actual slave state. British people operated that slave state before America seceded and won its independence from the UK. I think it was England at the time. It wasn't UK yet. Right. But I don't know if there's a legacy of us having lived side by side with each other as slave and free, and then had to integrate as all free people.
Possibly.
Yeah. And if there's still a history there, whereas there isn't that history in England.
Possibly.
Where there weren't actual slaves and masters who lived side by side and then had to completely change how they related to each other.
Who knows what the reason is? I doubt it has anything much to do with slavery, because no slaves are alive and no slave masters are alive. I think it has a lot to do with a certain conditioning that we Americans are exposed to. I notice sometimes, many, many times in America, there's a certain kind of a nervousness or defensiveness or hostility that I'm picking up from white Americans in this country. And I'm not getting that in the UK from people. Now, most of my experience is in London, because that's where I'm working, that's where I'm living. Maybe people are a bit more open-minded there. Maybe they don't get that same kind of conditioning. I went to Scotland shortly after I came, and I've been to Scotland about 4 times in the past year and a half. But the first time I went there, I saw a Confederate flag and an American flag flying together at a football field, which is soccer in America.
Right.
And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, seeing a Confederate flag way up here. Yeah, that gave me kind of a strange feeling. What's it doing here? What are they trying to say?
What was it doing there?
I don't know.
Okay.
But it did give me because then I started to think maybe that was their way of saying, we don't really want non-whites here. Because that could not be their way of saying that we identify with the civil rights.
This is our proud Southern
the
heritage.
Civil War. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We were on the Confederate side.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, flying that flag in Scotland said to me, it's not standing for American history. Mm-hmm. It's standing for how we feel about certain people.
Right.
That was just how I saw it. That may not be how they see it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't ask whoever put the flag there, why did you put the flag there? And what does it mean to you? But just me, passing by, seeing it, that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, I can understand you not wanting to ask them in that moment. I kind of wish I would ask, because now I'm curious. If you give me the address, then just ask a passerby. Hey, laddie.
It was amazing.
Oh,
it really was.
Guarding their personal safety.
In this country where everyone's allowed to have a gun, can you blame them?
I guess. I don't know that much about what some of them deal with depending on where they live or how they grew up, but I think it's a shame that it limits them. And we've talked about the limitations that some people put on themselves to travel. And one of the things you mentioned is that you wish there was a way that travel could seem less bougie. Right. To use your word, and also a word that I've become fond of using.
It's a privilege. I hate that word, by the way. Other people bestow it on me. I don't use that word, but it is a privilege to go to university in this country. It is equally a privilege to leave your country and just see another place. America's unique. We go from one coast thousands of miles to another coast, ocean to ocean.
There's a lot to see right here, too.
There is so much ground to cover, literally. And Americans are very diverse. The terrain's diverse. The people are diverse. The cuisine's diverse. I mean, I can understand just not really having the urge to go abroad because there's so much here. I'm not going to blame Americans. I'm not going to blame anyone for not traveling abroad because of what America is. You go to some other country, some other part of the world that's surrounded by 5 different nations on their border.
The Andorras and Lesotho's of the world.
Right. Their perspective of crossing borders is completely different. Mm-hmm. Their perspective of language fluency, knowing other languages besides the one that's your native tongue. For them, it's just normal. Of course. 100 miles away, they're speaking French. And, in another direction, they're speaking Italian. So, yeah, if we want to be able to navigate these areas, of course we're going to be speaking those languages too.
I think you're talking about Switzerland.
There you are.
In this little game of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego trivia. What is Switzerland?
Might as well throw German in there too.
I guess.
Yeah. Might as well. It's just...